Welcome, brave viewer. Tonight, we open a door that was never meant to be. Opened a door that leads not to a throne room, nor a golden age of glory, but to a silent bedchamber where the last Tudor monarch waited for death with open eyes and shaking hands. You've seen her painted in pearls and power. You've heard her name wrapped in triumph, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Empress of an empire on which the sun never set. But what if I told you that all of it was a mask, and when she died, the mask was taken off? This is the story of the mask she could not control. A death mask, cold, pale, unflinching, molded from the decaying face of a dying queen whose kingdom bowed, but whose body broke, whose enemies burned, but whose guilt never did. And this chilling relic is no ordinary royal artifact. It is the truth she spent over 4 decades trying to hide. Elizabeth I ruled England for 45 years. She was not just a queen, she was a storm in velvet. A master of illusion. A woman who never married, never yielded, and never aged. At least not in public. She faced down the might of the Spanish Armada. She crushed rebellion after rebellion. She imprisoned her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, and eventually signed her death warrant. She was beloved, feared, worshipped. But like all masks, hers began to crack. And when her closest allies began to die, Blanche Parry, William Cecil, and finally Catherine Howard, the Countess of Nottingham Elizabeth did not weep in public. She simply vanished. In the year 1590, Blanche Parry died, the woman who had served her since she was a child. Then in 1598, William Cecil, her most trusted counsellor, was gone. And by January of the year 1603, Elizabeth herself was collapsing into a deep and terrible silence. She withdrew to Richmond Palace, refused food, refused sleep, refused to lie down. For days, she stood in her rooms, silent, staring, unwilling to sit, as if sitting meant surrendering to death. Her ladies begged her to eat. Her physicians pleaded for permission to examine her. She dismissed them all. And when the Countess of Nottingham died after serving her for over 40 years, something in Elizabeth broke forever. They said she whispered to herself. They said she spoke to ghosts. They said she saw Mary Queen of Scots at the edge of her vision. The same Mary whose blood had stained her hands. The same Mary whose death Elizabeth would never admit to ordering, but who visited her, night after night, in dreams that felt like vengeance. Her ladies began to panic. The Queen's skin had turned ashen. Her body was withering. Her mind flickered like a candle in the wind. But still, she refused to rest. Until one night, she fell into her bed and whispered for the Archbishop of Canterbury. He came, and when he saw her, he wept. This was not the Queen he had known. This was not Gloriana, or the Virgin Monarch, or the woman who had ruled as an icon. This was a trembling old woman, almost 70 years of age, so haunted by guilt and so poisoned by time that even her pride had fled her. She asked him to pray, and he told her that she would be a queen in heaven, just as she had been on earth. And then, on the 24th day of March, in the year 1603, she was gone. Her death was not met with immediate mourning. Her body lay in Whitehall Palace for 3 weeks. And while England shifted toward a new era, the era of the Stuart king, James VI of Scotland, behind locked doors, the final act of her life was unfolding. Someone made a mold, a cast, a death mask, a perfect, lifeless imprint of her face. No painter's brush could save her now. No flattering portrait. No symbolic allegory. Just the raw, rotting truth of what time had done to the body that once stood above all others. The mask revealed sagging skin, deep lines, sunken eyes. It showed the lead makeup that had eaten into her flesh, the hollow cheeks of a woman who had refused nourishment, the ghost of power, barely human. That mask became the template for her tomb. And when you visit Westminster Abbey today and gaze upon her marble effigy crowned stiff, magnificent, you are not seeing a glorified tribute. You are seeing the last face she ever wore. And it is terrifying. It was common in those days to take death masks of royalty. But this one was different. This was the unmasking of an entire reign. Elizabeth had controlled every image of herself for decades. She had rewritten herself as a myth, overseen her portraits, dictated their style. But the death mask did not lie. It showed what she was in the end. A woman worn thin by time, weighed down by ghosts, and abandoned by the very illusions she had crafted. There are many theories about what killed her. Lead poisoning from her makeup, pneumonia, cancer, an untreated infection, or maybe just heartbreak. The truth is, we'll never know. But perhaps, in a strange way, her death mask tells us more than any diagnosis ever could. It tells us how far she fell from the woman the world believed her to be, and how thin the veil of majesty really was. 15 years after her death, Elizabeth was already a legend, a hero, a goddess in memory, if not in life. And yet, the mask remained cold, silent, and horrifyingly real. It is not her crown that endures. It is not her speeches. It is her final face, the one that no painter could fix, no writer could soften, and no subject could love. And so, we begin. There are some rooms in history where the walls remember everything. The heavy velvet, the cracked floorboards, the curtains pulled tight against a sky that no longer matters. In the winter of the year 1603, one such room existed in Richmond Palace, where a queen once danced and laughed and planned invasions, and where she would now stand without sleeping for days, staring into the shadows, waiting for a death she would not name. Elizabeth I had not slept in 4 days, or perhaps 5. The count was lost to the silence. Her ladies whispered to one another in the corners of the chamber, but none dared raise their voice. She stood, motionless, beside her bed, cloaked in heavy black, her body thinner than it had ever been, her hands clasped in front of her like a statue that had forgotten what it was meant to represent. Every hour, another candle burned down to its base. But still, she would not sit. Still, she would not lie down. Still, she would not eat. They said the queen was in mourning. But for whom? For Blanche, her childhood companion, who had died 13 years earlier. For William Cecil, her iron-willed advisor, who had passed 5 years before. For Catherine Howard, the Countess of Nottingham, who had only just left this world days ago after over 4 decades of service and love. Or was she mourning something no one dared speak aloud herself? The Queen was disappearing, not with a cry, but with a long, slow retreat into the folds of her own mind. The courtiers sent messages in haste. Physicians were summoned and turned away, one after another. They arrived at the palace and were told Her Majesty refuses visitors. And even the ones allowed near her found little to do. She would not answer questions. She would not drink the broth they brought. She would not remove the ring from her finger. She simply stood, as if frozen between worlds. Even the fire in the hearth could not warm her. On the 3rd day, or perhaps it was the 4th, the candles flickered and went out for a time. And the Queen whispered a name. The women near her did not know whether they had truly heard it, or whether the room itself had spoken. Mary. She said it again, and the chamber seemed colder after that. Some say that the ghost of Mary, Queen of Scots, had come to claim her, not out of vengeance, but of pity. That Elizabeth had never recovered from that execution, that it had torn a hole in her pride, that even victory could not fill. Her cousin had been led to the block in the year 1587. Elizabeth had signed the death warrant, but she had not smiled that day. She had not spoken. She had turned her face to the wall, and stayed there for hours. And now, at the end of all things, she was speaking to Mary again. Not through letters or ambassadors, but through silence. The death mask had not yet been cast. The tomb had not yet been carved. But already, her body was preparing to leave her. The morning light that came through the stained glass window was thin and brittle. A kind of light that does not illuminate, but only reminds you that time is moving. Even when you are not. Elizabeth, once dressed in gold and rubies, now wore a plain black gown. Her famed red wig had been set aside. Her skin was bare, pale, and raw, with the faint traces of lead powder still clinging to the lines around her eyes. She looked like a candle burned too long. Hollowed, she had once laughed at time. Now she let it pass without resistance. There was a mirror in the room, draped in black cloth. No one touched it. No one dared. Mirrors were dangerous in a house of dying royalty. They could trap the soul, or worse, reflect a truth that even queens could not command. A cat came to her side once. No one knew where it had come from. A sleek, silent shadow. It curled beside her leg, and Elizabeth looked down for the first time in hours. She did not speak to it. She did not smile, but her hand moved, slowly, to stroke its back, and for a moment, only a moment, the room breathed again. By the sixth night, her ladies could no longer watch in silence. They sent for the Archbishop of Canterbury. He arrived at twilight, his face pale with worry, his hands full of prayers. He knelt beside her and asked her if she would allow him to speak for her soul. She looked at him, not through him, not above him, but at him, and her voice was quieter than dust. "Will I be a queen in heaven, as I was on earth?" she asked. He said yes. She closed her eyes, and the question never returned. That night, the Queen allowed them to bring her to her bed. Her bones ached from standing. Her lungs shivered with every breath. The sheets were clean. The pillows smelled of lavender. Her head sank into it without resistance. And the silence returned, not fearful, not angry, just heavy, like snow. Her ladies took turns sitting by her side. They held her hand, but she did not squeeze back. They brushed her hair, but her eyes did not open. The cat remained at the foot of the bed. Still as stone, she did not die that night, or the next. It would be one more full day before her body let go. They say that in the final hour, the candles brightened on their own, that a wind passed through the locked chamber, that her lips moved just once, but no one heard what she said. Her eyes did not close until the very end. And when they did, the cat stood up, leapt silently from the bed, and disappeared down the corridor. Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, the last of the Tudors, had died, not on a battlefield, not in a palace full of celebration, but in a silent room in Richmond, watched over by women in black, beside a mirror she had never dared to look into again. The silence stayed even after her breath had gone, and for 3 weeks her body would lie untouched, as England mourned or waited for what would come next. But the palace remembered, and it still does, long after the Queen closed her eyes. The women remained. They did not speak. They did not weep loudly. They simply stayed where they were, some sitting on the floor, backs against the walls, others perched quietly on the edge of low stools, lace handkerchiefs in their laps, eyes reddened but dry. The scent of lavender, smoke, and old roses drifted faintly in the room, mixing with the heavier air of waiting. It had been days since Elizabeth had spoken, hours since she had breathed, but still no one moved to cover her face. Not yet, because it wasn't just grief that held them there. It was guilt. It was memory. It was the unbearable slowness of history, turning its page. These women had dressed her in silks and jewels, They had powdered her face with white lead, combed through her red wigs, tied the laces of her gown so tightly that her breath came short but steady. They had watched her perform queenship like a sacred ritual. And now, they were watching her become what she had always feared, an ordinary woman in death. Lady Scrope had known her the longest. She sat nearest the bed, her knuckles pale as she clutched her rosary. Though she dared not say the prayers aloud, she had served Elizabeth since the Queen was barely more than a girl. Exiled and in danger, hiding behind the sharp eyes of those who wanted her gone. She had held her during fevered dreams. She had wrapped her arms around the girl who had cried out for a mother she never knew. And in all those years, she had never once seen Elizabeth admit fear. Until the final week. It was not death that frightened her. It was something deeper. Something that reached beneath the skin. Lady Scrope believed it was the past. The blood. The choices made long ago in darkened rooms. The names never spoken after they were buried. Anne Boleyn. Thomas Seymour. Mary of Scots. Guilt. Once buried, never truly dies. It only waits. Beside her, Lady Warwick wept without tears. Her eyes had long dried from vigil, but her breath still trembled. She had stood by the Queen when the Armada threatened to swallow England whole. She had heard Elizabeth speak in armour, riding before her troops at Tilbury, her voice carrying through fog and fear like a church bell. "I have the heart and stomach of a king," she had said, and they had believed her, all of them. But now, in this dim room, there was no voice left, no heart but the one's breaking in silence. Lady Mowbray whispered into her hand as if into the Queen's ear. Perhaps she was confessing, perhaps she was pleading. No one heard the words. The Queen's body had begun to cool. They could feel it, gently, without needing to touch her. Her skin, once hot with fever and unspoken thoughts, had surrendered to the stillness. And yet the room did not smell of death. Not yet. It smelled of powder, of orange water, oft-read violets, and something deeper like the last page of a book, left open too long. They remembered, each of them, what she had looked like before, when her eyes had caught the light and turned it into command, when she laughed at foreign kings and danced through court corridors like a flame, when she summoned Shakespeare to read her words, and scholars to test her wit, and suitors to fail before her throne. But even then, yes. Even then there had been moments when she paused too long, moments when her gaze fixed on the distance, moments when she turned away and forgot herself, just for a breath. Those were the moments they had learned to fear, because that was when the past reached out for her. Some nights, near the end, Elizabeth had spoken while half asleep. He bled. He bled on the floor, and I did nothing. Tell her I never meant it. I signed, but I never meant it. They lied to me. The papers were already sent. I was just a girl. I was just a girl when she died. The ladies said nothing. They only watched when Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. The news had arrived like a dagger wrapped in silk. Elizabeth had gone white. She had struck the table. She had blamed her secretaries, her advisers, her own shadow, if it would listen. And then she had wept. Alone. For hours. Not because Mary had deserved to live, but because Elizabeth had not deserved to kill her. And that guilt, once planted, never left her chambers. It grew there, like ivy in the cracks of the walls, winding tighter each year. She had kept her hands clean in life. But in dreams, they were always red. Outside the palace, the river moved without notice. It lapped against stone and carried fallen leaves toward places they would never see. The bells in the distance did not ring yet. London had not been told. The couriers had been dispatched. But the world still turned as if she were alive. In the hall outside her chamber, a young maid sat with her back to the door, clutching a tray she had never delivered. It held wine, bread, and a small folded letter. No one had dared take it from her hands. No one had told her to leave. One of the Queen's gloves lay on the floor. No one moved to pick it up. They could not yet bear to touch anything she had touched, for fear it would fall apart in their hands. Or worse, remain warm. There had been talk of embalming, of dressing her body in white, of removing the lead from her face, of preparing her for the mask. But the ladies could not yet agree. Some wanted to preserve her, as she was tired, regal, mortal. Others whispered that the world must not see her this way, that the legend must return before the people arrived. But they could not erase what they had seen. They could not unhear the words she had spoken in half-sleep. They could not forget the way her eyes had stared, open and still, until the last breath passed, like a sigh from someone else's lungs. The sun fell low behind Richmond Palace, and in that room, where guilt had slept beside power, and women had watched without blinking, the Queen remained, no longer watching, but watched. They came for her before the world awoke, when the frost still clung to the edge of the window panes, and the river held its breath beneath a skin of thin ice. And though the women had known the day would arrive, when men would knock gently at the chamber doors and request the Queen's body with solemn voices and gloved hands, none of them moved at first, for the silence in the room had settled like snow, and there was something sacred in the stillness that felt unbreakable, as though the Queen, though cold, might yet shift under the linen. I might open her eyes once more to ask what all the fuss was about, and remind them that she would choose the time, not death, not men, not the turning of any calendar or bell, but the bells did toll that morning, not loud, not jubilant, but long and heavy. A single chime stretched across the river bank, echoed from Westminster to Whitehall, and with it came the barges draped in black, and the guards in their crimson and sable, and the priests with their incense, and the slow, deliberate footfalls of a nation, remembering how to mourn a monarch who had, for so long, refused to die. Her body was lifted from the bed, not like a corpse, but like a relic, wrapped in layers of silk and velvet, sealed inside a coffin lined with white satin, and on top of that wooden box they placed her crown, not the state crown, not the golden arches or jewelled orb, but the small circlet she had worn in quieter days, when she read by candlelight or walked alone in the garden without her ladies. And even in death, it looked too small for the vastness of the legacy she left behind. But it was hers, and the women insisted that nothing else would do. Not now. Not after all she had endured, and all they had watched her become. The procession began at Richmond, where trees bowed under the weight of a still sky, and moved slowly toward Whitehall. The coffin placed on a barge draped in black velvet, flanked by oarsmen in mourning livery, each stroke of their oars parting the river like a blade through silk. And on the banks, the people stood in silence, some with heads uncovered, some on their knees, some holding their children up to see the Queen pass by for the last time, not as a sovereign in triumph, but as a story being laid to rest. They said the Thames itself wept that day, not with storm or rain, but with a slow mist that hovered above the water, curling around the barge and its riders, softening every sound until the only things that remained clear were the creak of the wood and the splash of the oars. And those who stood along the banks would say, even years later, that the Queen did not pass like the dead, usually do she glided, silent and untouchable, as if the river had turned to glass beneath her, and the current dared not carry her away too quickly. At Whitehall, they did not immediately place her in the vault. They watched. For 3 weeks. They watched. Her coffin lay in state in the great hall, surrounded by candles that never burned low, watched over day and night by guards who did not speak. And when visitors came to kneel before the draped casket, No one spoke above a whisper, as though the queen might yet be listening, might yet change her mind, might rise and speak once more from within the velvet. Because she had defied expectation for 45 years, and what was one more miracle to a woman who had worn the mask of youth for half a century, the people came in silence, pressing their hands to their hearts, some leaving notes folded small and hidden beneath the tapestries, others weeping without tears, because it is not easy to say goodbye to something larger than oneself, to a woman who had become myth while still alive, who had ruled not only with law and sword, but with story, with symbolism, with silence, always with silence, and now that silence was all that remained. There were rumors. Of course, there are always rumors when a great one dies. Some said her body had turned to stone, that she had not decayed, that the lead in her cosmetics had preserved her beyond nature, that her skin had become as white and hard as marble, and that even death could not undo her. Others whispered that the mask had been cast too soon, before she had truly died, and that the impression left was not of peace, but of resistance, a scream caught in stillness, a final refusal moulded into wax. But the truth was quieter than all of that. The truth was that she had been tired, so very tired, and when the time came, she had let go, not with thunder or prophecy, but with a single sigh and a blink that never returned. The tomb had not yet been finished. It had been designed during her lifetime, as most royal tombs were, but she had revised it again and again, ordering more grandeur, more symbolism, more gold, more silence. And when her body arrived at Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of kings and saints, the vault that had once held her grandfather, Henry VII, was reopened to receive her, though the monument itself would take longer to complete. And as they laid her body within the vault, high above the bones of her half-sister Mary, a choice was made not just of stone and position, but of memory. Elizabeth would lie above Mary, a queen above a queen, a Protestant above a Catholic, a victor above a warning. And though the tomb would later bear an inscription of unity, partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary. Sisters in hope of resurrection, the positioning spoke louder than any carved verse. England was choosing what it would remember, and what it would bury. They say the final candle burned out the moment the vault was sealed, that no flame was needed afterward, that the darkness itself was reverent enough. And so the Queen, who had once turned courtrooms into theatres, who had bent nations to her will with a glance, who had ruled as both woman and symbol, was left beneath stone and scripture, beneath centuries of silence, beneath the footsteps of tourists and kings alike. And though time would reshape her legacy, would coat her memory in gold and grandeur, would turn her into Gloriana, into myth, into marble, the truth lay below, quiet and undisturbed, the coffin with a crown, the face beneath a mask, and the river that once froze in her passing. They came in pairs, always in pairs, as if one alone could not bear the weight of what they were about to see. And though they were called physicians by name and servants by duty, none among them walked with confidence when summoned into the room where the Queen no longer breathed. For it was one thing to tend to a living sovereign who could order your death with a frown, but quite another to tend to a body that once ruled empires and now lay utterly still, her silence heavier than her crown had ever been. And though their hands had once shaken with reverence, it was now fear that guided them. Quiet and thick as the velvet draped around the windows, they had waited, longer than they should have, longer than tradition dictated. Some said it was respect. Others whispered it was hesitation, because beneath the silk and lace, there was something. None of them dared name an uncertainty, not about her death, but about her flesh, about what time and powder and poison might have done to a body so carefully painted for half a century. and now left to show itself. Unvarnished. Beneath the mask of mortality, the first physician to approach the coffin did so with his head bowed low. Not from humility, but from dread. And in his hands were the tools of his trade cloths, soaked in sweet wine, jars of amber oils, narrow silver scalpels, sharpened not for harm, but for preparation, for transformation, for the act of turning a corpse into something still beautiful, still clean, still fit to be remembered. And as he lifted the lid, there was no ceremony, no fanfare, only the hush of the chamber deepening. Like breath being held across all of England, they had expected decay. They had feared it. They had braced themselves for the stink of rot, for the bruising of flesh, for the cruelty of time reclaiming its toll. But none of that greeted them. The Queen had not decayed. Her body lay as though in sleep, the lips pale. Yes, but closed gently. The cheeks hollow. Yes, but still touched with the faintest ghost of rouge. The skin smooth, unblemished, almost waxen, as if death had simply paused before the final act. As if the centuries of control Elizabeth had wielded over her appearance had stretched even into this last stage, refusing to relinquish her to the usual processes of the grave. It unnerved them. It unsettled them. It did not feel natural. One physician whispered that the lead had done it, that the decades of white paste, of powdered ceruse, laced with poison, had sealed the Queen's pores and slowed the rot, that the same substance which had hollowed her from within now preserved her from without. And in that bitter irony lay a final defiance, a final triumph, that even death could not wear away what vanity had built. But another man older, more learned, quieter, said nothing. He stared too long at her hands, at the curve of her neck, at the place behind the ear where no powder had ever been allowed. And though he made no declaration, the furrow in his brow deepened, and those watching began to realize that what they saw was not preservation. It was resistance. The Queen's body did not rest. It held itself, clenched, as though some part of her had refused the passing, had braced against it, even in final moments. And though the skin was intact, it felt tight, like parchment stretched too thin over truth. They dared not say it aloud, but they each felt it, the unease, the dissonance, the sense that something was being held back, not by the corpse, but by the memory inside the room, by the walls that had heard her secrets, by the throne, not yet cold. She had always controlled the narrative. Even now, she did not let it go. And so they lied. Not to the court, not to the people, to themselves. They told one another that her peace was perfect, that her skin was serene, that no pain had marked her, that no illness had lingered long enough to leave a trace. But they all remembered the last weeks, the long vigils, the stubborn refusals to eat, the bruises from standing too long, the trembling hands, the breath that caught like a knot in the throat. And they knew that what they now saw was not serenity, but the afterimage of a body forced to behave long after it should have fallen apart. One man, a younger assistant with shaking fingers, reached toward her cheek. He meant to dab it gently with cloth, to see if the makeup might smear, if the surface would flake. But the moment his cloth touched her skin, something in the room shifted. Not a sound, not a light, only a sense of presence, a warning. He stepped back, Bal, as though he had violated a sanctuary. The cloth fell from his hand. Dry, the cheek remained unchanged. He left the room and did not return. The embalmers continued their work, slower than usual, less assured. Their prayers whispered between strokes of the brush, their hands less steady than their predecessors had been in ages past. Because they were not preparing a corpse, They were preparing a symbol, a relic, a woman who had ruled for 45 years, and who now, even in death, would not allow herself to appear anything less than divine. They packed her body with herbs, rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, myrrh for purity, the rose petals for the crown, and they sealed her within layers of linen laced with lavender oil, not to cover the scent of death, but because there was none yet, only the perfume of power, clinging to fabric like the last breath of summer, clinging to a leaf before it falls. They reported to the Privy Council that the Queen had been embalmed successfully, that her body showed no signs of distress, that she had passed without suffering. They told the story that needed to be told. And in the dark corners of the palace, where servants whispered and shadows clung to staircases, the truth was passed between hands like smuggled letters, soft, unspoken, indéniable. She had not rotted, but she had not rested either, and those who had touched her face, those who had laid linen over her heart, those who had opened the lid and looked into the silence, none of them ever forgot what they saw. Not because it was horrible, but because it was incomplete, as though the Queen had paused in dying, as though her soul had chosen to linger, as though there was still something left to say, and no one had dared ask what it was. For days after the vault was sealed, and the tombstone lowered over the last of the Tudor breath, the crown remained without a head, and the throne without a voice. And those who walked the corridors of Whitehall did so with lighter steps, not from relief or celebration, but from something closer to confusion. For though they had all prepared themselves for her death, whispered about it, imagined it, feared it, they had not prepared for her absence, which proved far more unsettling than her dying had ever been. Because Elizabeth had been more than a monarch, more than a woman, more than the rituals she upheld, or the edicts she signed. She had been England itself, wrapped in lace and ceremony and stubborn silence. And now, suddenly, the space where she had been felt so vast that no man could cross it without becoming lost. They had summoned James, not with drums or golden scrolls, but with letters hurried across wet roads and over frozen rivers, letters sealed in wax that trembled under the pressure of transition. For no matter how carefully written, no matter how practiced the praise or graceful the invitation, the truth beneath the ink remained raw. They were inviting a stranger to wear her crown, to walk her halls, to sit in her chair, still warm with memory. And though they called him king with their pens, none of them said it aloud. Not yet. Not until they had seen him with their own eyes. Because they still half believed she might return, that her hand might rise from beneath stone and command them once more not to be so hasty. In the throne room, the tapestries still hung as she had left them. The great cushion on the chair of state remained slightly indented. Not from her weight, she had grown too frail to leave impressions, but from the years she had ruled without rising, the decades she had, filled with gaze and gesture, her presence sufficient to silence all dissent. Now, no one sat there. They had dusted the throne, but none had dared approach it since it was not out of loyalty. It was not out of fear. It was something older, something deeper. The sense that the wood itself had memory, and that it might reject any new hand not shaped by the same trials. And so the throne sat cold as the stone under which she now lay, as cold as the bed where she had once stood awake for days, refusing to lie down, refusing to surrender, as cold as the letters that arrived from Scotland, each marked with a new seal, a new order, a new rhythm. James would come. Of course he would come, but in those weeks between, England held its breath. The bells tolled on Sunday mornings, and then were silent for the rest of the week. Churches were full, but no one sang loudly. Markets opened, but coins passed hands without chatter. Children were shushed more than usual, and courtiers walked past portraits of the Queen with eyes lowered, as if afraid she might still be watching, still judging, still commanding from beyond the silk-draped veil. One evening, two ladies of the former privy chamber crept into the chapel, cloaked and veiled, holding candles close to their chests, and sat beneath the high windows where the light used to fall on Elizabeth's face during service. They did not pray. They did not speak. They simply sat in silence, listening for footsteps that never came, and remembering the feel of her ring pressing into their palms when she took their hands, the weight of her gaze when she was displeased, the rare softness of her voice when she thanked them, which had happened so few times they could count each one. And outside, the wind whispered through bare trees and over muddy courtyards, carrying no crown, no song, only the hollow echo of change. When James finally crossed into England, it was with banners and pageants and flattery, heavy enough to sink a barge. But still, the throne did not welcome him easily. It remained an empty thing, carved and polished again, but empty all the same, because it had been shaped not by the man who would now claim it, but by a woman who had refused to let time shape her, and in that refusal had reshaped time itself. And the people, for all their cheers and gifts and tokens of loyalty, watched him with eyes that had not yet forgotten her, with ears that still remembered the cadence of her final speech, with hearts that had not yet learned how to beat to the rhythm of a new reign. They placed the crown on James's head. They handed him the scepter and orb. They wrote his name into the scrolls. But still, when they walked past her tomb, they lowered their voices. Still, when her name was spoken, it came not as a footnote, but as a thunderclap followed by silence. Still, when a breeze passed through the halls at dusk, some swore they heard her footsteps. Because the throne had not chosen to be empty, it had been abandoned by death. And death, even when it finishes its task, leaves behind an echo that cannot be silenced with gold or marble. They tried. Of course they tried. They repainted the chambers. They replaced the tapestries. They wrote new laws and sang new anthems and issued new coins with a new face. But beneath it all, the crown still felt colder than it should, as if waiting, as if mourning, as if remembering the shape of the head it once knew. And the throne, silent and immense, watched and waited. It began with the candles, and though no one would admit it in public, the first whispers came, not from children or superstitious maids, but from the oldest monks of Westminster themselves, men who had seen queens crowned and kings buried, who had watched scaffolds rise in palace yards and heard last confessions from trembling lips, men who feared no spirit because they had already seen too many bones. But when the candles flickered, all at once, and without wind, their silence turned to stillness. And stillness, in sacred places, is the oldest form of fear. It was a morning like any other in the abbey, cold with breath on stone and dust, hanging golden in thin light. The choir boys preparing for their first chant, the sacristan arranging robes folded 3 times over, with the same care passed down for generations. And yet, when they approached the north transept, where the tomb of Elizabeth stood silent and immense above the grave of her sister Mary, they saw it 12 tall candles, fresh and full, burned to stubs in the night. Their wax spilled down iron holders like melted hours, but no one had lit them, and no one had entered the chapel since Vespers, and the doors had been locked, and the wind had not blown. The boy who found them was pale for days, but not from fear. He said he had heard nothing, seen nothing, except that when he stepped into the chapel, he had felt something like weight, not on his shoulders, but across his thoughts, as if a presence had looked through him and then passed by without stopping. And when he turned to the tomb, he had seen not with his eyes, but with that inner part of knowing that dreams often use, that the effigy had moved, not its face or its hands, but the folds of the stone robe had changed, or perhaps softened, as if someone had been standing beside it, praying or whispering or weeping. The monks blessed the chapel. They relit the candles. They changed the wax, and yet it happened again, 3 nights later, and again, until someone said the word ghost. Not with jest, not with thrill, but with weariness, like a man saying, winter after the first frost. They began to notice other things, a bell tolling once at midnight, though no rope was pulled, a window found open each dawn, though no hand had unlatched it, a faint scent of orange blossom, strongest near the altar, a perfume no one had worn since the Queen had died, and once, only once, a guard swore he saw a woman in black pass beneath the archway by candlelight, hair vile long, her shoulders thin, her step neither fast nor slow, and though he called out to her, she did not turn, and when he followed, she was gone, and the flame she had carried left no trace, and her footsteps left no sound. He never told the story again, but he never returned to that hallway either. The whispers spread, not loudly, not with drama, but in glances exchanged across corridors, in prayers spoken a little faster than usual, in hands that trembled slightly when relighting the candles near her tomb. They said she had come back because she was not done, because her reign had never truly ended, because a soul so tied to image and order would not surrender easily to the chaos of the grave. Some said she watched the new king from beyond, judging, measuring, deciding. Others said she mourned still, that she could not rest because she had never wept properly in life. And grief, when withheld too long, must be walked out in death, step by silent step, through cloisters and candle smoke. But the most chilling tale came from a choir boy too young to lie well, who once, during rehearsal, turned suddenly toward the Queen's tomb and whispered, "Yes, Your Majesty," with such natural tone that the choirmaster asked him who he was speaking to. And the boy answered, "The lady behind the stone. She said I was singing flat." No one laughed. They changed the key that day. And from then on, no boy stood near the tomb for too long. The tomb itself remained unchanged. Cold, white, colossal, her likeness carved in marble, her crown eternal, her hands folded over a scepter, never dropped. But those who knelt before it began to feel something, a hush that went beyond reverence, a weight behind the air, like a gaze waiting just out of reach. And more than once, visitors were seen glancing behind their shoulders, as if someone had entered just after them, only to find the chapel empty. They wrote no official record. The clergy would not allow it. The court denied the rumors. But still, the candles burned too quickly. Still, the scent of her perfume returned in spring. Still, the silence around her name remained deeper than for any monarch before or after, because Elizabeth had never truly shared power in life, and it seemed she would not share peace in death. Her tomb was placed above her sister's to show her supremacy, but perhaps it had also placed her closer to the world she left behind, close enough to see, close enough to remember, close enough to walk. When the bells refused to ring and the candles refused to burn, and so the abbey learned to live with her, not in fear, not in praise, but in acceptance, because some legacies do not end, they echo. There are places in this world where silence becomes heavier than stone, where air does not move, and time folds in on itself like damp linen pressed into corners. And beneath Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens sleep in ranks of carved effigies and dust-covered names, there lies a vault beneath the vault, a chamber deeper than ceremony, darker than memory, a space meant for rest, but restless in its stillness. And it is here, under layers of marble and myth, that Elizabeth of England rests, or is said to, because those who have stepped near it, those few entrusted with keys and records and torches that do not burn warm, have often returned with questions. Not about her reign, but about what was left behind when the crown no longer needed a head to rest on. They sealed her in silence. Yes, but silence does not forget. It listens, it records, it remembers what stone was never meant to hold, and beneath her tomb, beneath the Latin verse and the coiled lines and the careful symmetry, there is another chamber, deeper and colder, not marked on the maps given to tourists or scholars, not inscribed in official diagrams, but whispered of in margins and footnotes, a burial vault from an earlier time, built not for a queen, but for a question. Some say the chamber had been meant for Henry VII's unnamed child, a son who did not live long enough to be remembered. Others say it was a holding place for relics confiscated during the dissolution of the monasteries. Chalices, bones, sacred books, the kinds of things too dangerous to display and too holy to destroy. But there is another theory, one kept close by the handful of archivists who guard such thoughts, that the vault beneath Elizabeth's vault holds not only the dead, but the unspoken. There is no official record of what was placed there the day Elizabeth was entombed, but several reports from the early 17th century reference a second procession, smaller, quieter, carried out, not in daylight, but at night, with no bells, no chants, no hymns, only 6 men in dark cloaks, and a single cart draped in black cloth, moving through a side entrance of the abbey, not by the main nave, but along the northern ambulatory, their faces hooded, their cargo silent, their names never recorded. What did they carry, and why was it taken beneath the Queen? There are guesses. Of course, some say it was the body of Robert Dudley, long dead, reburied in secret beside the woman who had loved him too much to marry him, and too little to forget. Others believe it was the death mask itself, sealed away not for preservation, but for concealment, because it revealed something no one wanted history to remember. Perhaps the face twisted in regret, perhaps the eyes still open, perhaps the likeness too accurate to be allowed light. But the most persistent whisper, the one repeated with the greatest caution, is that the chamber contains not a body, but papers, letters, orders, confessions, a locked box, iron bound, engraved with no crest, delivered by hand, placed beneath the Queen by her own command, to be buried with her, unread, unopened, guarded by stone, sealed not with wax, but with the weight of fear. Some say it contains the warrant for Mary, Queen of Scots, signed, not in ink, but in her own bloodied hand, after hours of torment. Others believe it holds a letter from Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, smuggled from the Tower on the eve of her execution, addressed to the child she would never hold. And there are those who claim it contains nothing at all, only the emptiness of a woman who needed even her secrets to be sealed in ceremony. Because to die without mystery would be to die small. But if the vault exists, and it does, then so do its contents. And the abbey keeps its silence, as it was taught, and the archivists turn their keys only when no one is watching. And even then, only to the door, never further, never deeper, because there is something about the way the air changes near that hidden threshold, something about the feeling in the bones when one stands above it, something about the way the torches flicker, not from wind, but from presence. One man, a stonemason repairing the southern wall of the crypt in the year 1793, wrote in a letter that the floor near Elizabeth's tomb did not ring hollow like the others. He said it sounded tight, like something was waiting to exhale. He was dismissed from service 6 weeks later. His letter was found in his grandson's attic, a century after that. And still, the tomb stands, as it always has, white, grand, crowned, her marble face facing upward toward the vaulted ceiling that never answers prayers. Her hands folded in stone, her robe stiff with cold history. But below that, somewhere beneath the carved date of her death, and the verse that names her a queen in life and a sister in the grave, there lies another place, another silence, another secret. They say if you stand above it in the earliest hour of morning, just before the light breaks through the east window, and close your eyes, you can hear something faint, distant, like the sound of pages turning, or silk brushing against stone, or a breath drawn slowly by someone who has no lungs. The Abbey does not speak of this. The records remain sealed. The official maps end at the vault's edge. But stone remembers, and silence, when pressed too long beneath weight and marble, becomes a voice of its own. And she who controlled every portrait, every proclamation, every page, she would not have left without writing the final one herself. There are some stories that do not end when the last line is written, some lives that do not retreat when the tomb is sealed, and some names that echo longer than the breath that once carried them. And Elizabeth, Queen of England, last of the Tudors, daughter of thunder and steel, did not disappear when her eyes closed, nor when her body stiffened, nor even when her marble effigy was raised above the vault where her heart no longer beat. For there are legacies that resist burial, that seep upward through stone and memory and time. And though England has known many rulers, there are few whose shadows still stretch across centuries, silent and weightless, yet heavy as iron. She was not the first queen, nor the last, not the most beautiful nor the most beloved, not the most merciful nor the most feared. But she was the one who turned survival into a throne, solitude into strategy, womanhood into weapon. And from the moment her crown touched her brow in the year 1558, she became something no man at court could predict, and no enemy abroad could define. She became endurance, in rough and crimson and calculated silence, and when she died, they expected her to fade. But she did not, because Elizabeth did not rule only with decree. She ruled with image, with symbol, with story. She crafted herself not as a monarch, but as a myth. And myths do not sleep. They do not crumble. They do not rot. They linger, like the lace of a gown long gone, like the scent of a page turned in candlelight, like a voice that once rang across a field and now stirs only in dreams. In the centuries that followed, kings came and went. War rolled over England like fog and fire. Parliaments rose and fell. Towers cracked. Gardens changed shape. Names were forgotten. Banners faded. Bloodlines tangled and thinned. But somewhere in the hush between history books and whispered prayers, Elizabeth remained, not in flesh, not even in stone, but in presence, in the way people still speak her name with a quiet kind of certainty, the way one speaks of dawn, or winter, or the tide inevitable, complex, and far away, yet always returning. Children learn her face before they understand her name. Tourists stand before her tomb, without knowing why their voices fall. Artists still try to capture her, though they never get it right. Writers trace her words, searching for meanings she never spoke aloud. And somewhere, somehow, deep within the silence of the Abbey, it feels as though she is watching, still not angrily, not with regret, but with that same cool calculation. She carried through life, measuring the world that came after her, and deciding, once again, what she will allow it to remember. She has been praised, condemned, dramatized, softened, hardened, and retold, until the lines between her truth and her image have frayed beyond repair. But perhaps that was her final genius, not to be remembered as she was, but to be remembered at all, because disappearance was the one thing she could never allow. Her mother disappeared. Her sister disappeared. Even her father, for all his brutality, became less man than legend. But Elizabeth would not be reduced. Not to a painting, not to a date, not to dust. And so she remains, in the hearts of those who kneel before her tomb and feel something deeper than history, in the silence of the vault that holds what no one dares open, in the stories told in long paragraphs and slow voices. Late at night, when the world is quiet enough to listen, she remains, not as a saint, not as a savior, but as a woman who lived so carefully, so fiercely, so stubbornly, that even death could not erase her edges. And so if tonight you feel the breath of history close against your cheek, if you pass a statue and feel a pulse behind the marble, if you light a candle and watch the flame bow, as if in reverence, know this: she is not gone. She is not forgotten. She is not finished. She is simply watching